Alright, so we're going to get started, so that sounds good. Alright, so I just want to say huge thanks to Dr. Roy and Mr. Fontanas for hosting this event today. My name is Susan Spiga. I'm the Executive Director of Education Voters in Pennsylvania. We are a partner in the Pennsylvania Schools Work Campaign, which is a statewide group of organizations that work to achieve adequate and equitable funding for public education. What schools will look like in the fall is largely dependent on what our state legislature decides to do with the education budget over the next few weeks and months. And we are here today in Bethlehem, and advocates and school leaders are gathered in 5 other regions to call on our state leaders to, we're raising our voices loudly and together from school districts that are rich and poor, school districts that are large and small, rural, urban, and suburban, to call on the legislature to support the state investment in public education that our students need and deserve. And so I'm just delighted to have school directors from a number of school districts and the ARC of Pennsylvania here with us today. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Roy to kick us off.
So good morning, everyone. Mr. Fontanes wanted to make sure everyone knew we were at Marvine. The sign's coming up, but we are here at Marvine Elementary School in Bethlehem Area School District. So I want to just quickly recognize our school board members that who are with us that will not be speaking. So some folks that will not be speaking. Dr. Kim Shively from the Bethlehem Area School Board is here. We also have Dr. Chris Wolfel, the Executive Director of IU20. Dr. Marilyn Martinez, the Interim Superintendent of Allentown. Welcome to the Lehigh Valley. And a number of BASD administrators and the head of our, Laura Ketting, the head of our Teachers Association as well. I just want to give a few key points on why increased state funding is important and why we can't be confused by the fact that we're getting federal stimulus money, which is for one-time expenses. We can't ignore the ongoing expenses we've had. And I have this as a handout that we can give to members of the media as well. Since 2013-14, Bethlehem's special education costs increased by $18 million, but the state share of those costs only increased $1.5 million. The rest is picked up by the local taxpayers. In 13-14, the state percent share of those special education costs was 21%. The state covered 21% of special education costs, and now it's down to 16%. Again, the larger share. We're talking about state mandated costs, things that we are required to do to assist our students. Charter tuition is another example of a mandated cost without state funding to support it. In 2006-07, Bethlehem's the basic education funding we received from the state. When we paid our charter school bill, we had $16.5 million left to use for our students in the district. That was 6-7. In 13-14, after we paid our charter school bills, we had $12 million left for the 14,000 students in our district. This year, we only have about $2 million of the state funding left to go to BASD programs and students. And next year, in 2021-22, our projection is that we'll have 33,000 left. So basically, the entire basic education subsidy that BASD receives from the state goes out the door to charter schools and tuition. So the 2,000-ish students in charter schools, money goes to those charters where they are, while our students have basically zero left from the state funding. Since 14-15, the BASD's increase the state's increase in the basic education funding to our school district has been $6 million. Our share of pension costs has gone up $13 million. So the point of these numbers is that the mandated costs, whether it's special ed, whether it's charter schools, whether it's pensions, all things the district does not have real control over, have grown significantly, while the state funding is not kept up to help us pay for those things. And then we're in the position of either cutting other programs or raising taxes. And so the state's failure to keep up with mandated costs ultimately lands on the local property tax owner in our district. This is why we're calling for additional state funding this year. Let's not act like the federal funding is the solution to ongoing costs. We need to consider increasing the state's share of BEF to continue to support districts, because we haven't kept up over the last decade. All right, I will stop there and turn it over to our next speaker, Nancy Wilt, School Board Director from Allentown.
Thank you, Dr. Roy, and thank you, Susan Spica, for offering me the opportunity to speak today on behalf of the Allentown School District and for holding this press conference regarding funding inequities. My name is Nancy Wilt, and I'm currently serving as president of the Allentown School Board. But more importantly, I've been a proud mom in the Allentown School District since 2005. I've watched the evolution of our district from the funding cuts of 2009, which drastically impacted our class offerings, to the cut in state reimbursement for charter tuition, which continues to increase and decimate our budget, making it even harder to compete as more resources are immediately allocated to that expense, and also to the direct impact these financial constraints have had on our students and our staff. I have met and built relationships with students and families in poverty who are doing everything they can to dig themselves out of their economic circumstances, all while the system is failing them by not providing the basic needs in technology and others. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown an even brighter light on the funding disparities in our state. In the beginning of the pandemic and the state shutdown, ASD faced the financial challenges of securing the necessary technology to even continue online learning for our students. The first round of federal relief dollars were instrumental for us in securing that technology and necessary renovations in PPE to get our students back in the building finally this April. And now we must focus on addressing learning loss and the social and emotional impact the pandemic has compounded for our students. The rising cost of charter tuition, pensions, coupled with the underfunding for basic education, have required districts like Allentown to rely heavily on local tax revenues just like Bethlehem. As we begin to emerge from the impact of this pandemic, many of the families who are our tax base are also working to get their finances back in order. A state increase in basic education funding will provide a more solid foundation for districts to build their budgets, use one-time federal dollars to address not only learning loss, but the social and economic impact and emotional impact the past has had on our students. I won't go into the numbers because Dr. Roy pretty much spot on. Allentown's in the same boat. We've had increases of 3% in basic education and mandated expenses of increases of up to 10%. Increases in special education subsidies will allow districts like Allentown to allocate more dollars to educating all students, addressing classroom and staffing needs, and addressing our aging school buildings. Allentown has 3 schools that are over 100 years old, and we have a middle school that was built during the Ulysses S. Grant administration. Our children truly are our future and the most important investment we can make. We must increase funding for education to at least cover rising mandated costs so districts can operate on a more level playing field. As our former superintendent Thomas Parker said, it cannot be the narrative of this city, this region, this district that Allentown children somehow deserve less. It cannot be our narrative that we educate our children with fewer resources. I stand today with school administrators, PA Schoolworks, and fellow board members from throughout the Valley to call on the Commonwealth to invest in our future by increasing education funding so that every child in Pennsylvania is provided all opportunities that they need to succeed. Thank you.
thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Sarah Nemitz, and I'm a member of the Salisbury Township School Board. It is critical that the state legislature increase state funding to cover the ever-increasing costs of state mandates, including PSERS and cyber and charter school tuition. While I'm thankful for the ESSER funds granted to schools by the federal government, those dollars are best spent with one-time expenditures incurred in the last 15 months. They do not help for the long-term issues of increased expenditures related to basic and special education, as well as other areas like cyber and charter school payments and contributions to the state retirement fund. Salisbury Township is in a very unique position in the Lehigh Valley when it comes to our tax revenue. We're one of the smallest districts and completely landlocked with little open space. Our tax base is fixed. Yes, we have the option to increase taxes according to the Act 1 index, which we have been doing, but our required spending in certain areas significantly outpaces the high tax increase. For example, in the 2018-19 school year, the district increased property taxes by 2.4%, which meant an additional $645,000 in collections. That same year, spending for special education increased by almost 8%, spending for charter school payments increased by almost 31%, and the district's required contribution to the PSERS state retirement system was 33.43%, a 3.69 increase over the year before. In total, these increases I just mentioned cost our district just over $1 million, $400,000 more than we were able to collect in property taxes. This also doesn't account for budgeting for inflationary costs to maintain services, salary increases required through collective bargaining agreements, and, and any additional spending necessary to meet students' needs. These increases are unsustainable in the long term and require action starting with the state budget being passed this June. We're asking for a minimum additional state investment to districts of $355 million, plus $200 million more for special education, and $10 million for career and technical education. The children in the Salisbury Township School District need you to support them by increasing state funding. Thank you for your time.
Hi, I'm Karen Beck-Cooley. I'm a school director here with Bethlehem Area School District. And I'd like to quote, "We need you to come together and fix Pennsylvania's broken education funding structure." That's the opening line in an open letter to Governor Wolf, House Speaker Cutler, and Senate President Corman, a letter that has already gained nearly 300 signatures, demanding that they address the Commonwealth's unacceptable, inequitable, and insufficient support for our public schools. If you want to add your name, you can find a link to that letter on the VASD Proud Parents website. It's under Hot Topics. That unacceptable, inequitable, and insufficient support for our public schools is exactly what you've been hearing about here. It's what we in the Valley have learned through some incredible reporting by the Morning Call on how zip codes determine the quality of a child's education, WFMZ, and the network's two-part Opportunity by Zip Code series. Pennsylvania has a larger per-pupil spending gap between its wealthiest and poorest school districts than any other state. This gap is so large because the state's support for public schools is so small. Pennsylvania currently ranks 47th out of 50 states in terms of its share of public school funding. Nationally, state dollars account for about half of all public school funding. Here in Pennsylvania, they account for just 1/3 of that funding. And this contribution varies by district. In Bethlehem, that contribution is even smaller. Only about 1/4 of our funding comes from the Commonwealth. Making matters worse, state dollars aren't allocated to districts based on need, but instead based on historic funding levels. In fact, about half of each district's current allocation of basic education funding from the state is based on their enrollment in the 1990-91 school year. So if you've changed since the early 1990s, you can imagine that most of our districts have too. Need would consider these changes, and it would consider, for example, whether a district's enrollment or its students' needs have grown. We've heard about special education funding increasing, for example. We have a system for quantifying need. Pennsylvania's fair funding formula takes all of this into account when determining how to allocate state dollars. The formula was passed nearly unanimously by both the House, where it got only 3 no votes, and the Senate, just 1 no vote, in 2015. And yet this fair funding formula is only used to distribute new money that's put towards basic education funding, and so allocates just 11% of all of those dollars. This makes Pennsylvania, quote, a case unto itself, according to a 50-state survey of public school funding approaches. And what it means, too, is that growing districts, like many that you've heard from here, receive collectively $1.14 billion less than the fair funding formula suggests that they should. It's important to note that over half of all Pennsylvania public school students attend schools that are underfunded in this way, and 80% of students of color in the Commonwealth also attend those underfunded schools. The underfunding figure for Bethlehem, to put this in context, is over $20 million, and you add up all the districts in the Lehigh Valley, Lehigh and Northampton County together, and that figure goes up to $100 million each year in underfunding. So who pays this price? Our students do, with spending cuts. Our taxpayers do, with tax increases like you've been hearing about. They're the ones paying to maintain essential academic and extracurricular programming and to keep up with the state mandates you've been hearing about here too. So it's time to act, to put state dollars towards our public schools and to make sure that state funding is tied to districts and students' needs. The governor's proposed budget does this. There are a number of other bills introduced in the Senate and in the House that do this. For the sake of our students throughout the Lehigh Valley, let's get this done.
Good morning. Thank you, Karen, and to all who went before me. And also thank you for this opportunity to address the community. My name is Jessica McKenty, and I'm the Director of Advocacy at the ARC of Lehigh and Northampton Counties, a nonprofit agency dedicated to educating, advocating, and providing services to individuals and families with intellectual and developmental disabilities across Lehigh and Northampton Counties. The ARC of Lehigh and Northampton Counties stands with PA Schools Work and our local school district administrators and personnel in a firm request to the General Assembly and the Governor to invest at least $1.15 billion in our schools to cover rising mandated costs this school year and the next that should not be paid for with one-time federal funds. This should include $200 million more for special education and $10 million for career and technical education. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the critical role schools play in our communities, as well as the glaring inequities in what resources students receive between one district and another. When the state passed the interim budget in June of 2020, special education received flat funding for the year. However, many students with disabilities continue to face educational regression and loss of supports and services due to COVID-19. For the past decade, expenditures for educating students with disabilities in Pennsylvania have been climbing steadily, mirroring a national trend. In 2018-19, the year that we have the most recent comprehensive data for, Pennsylvania school districts paid 72.6% of the cost of special education, while the state only paid 21.7% and the federal government 5.7%. Local districts were thereby forced, on average, to come up with 92 cents for every dollar in new special education expenses, a challenging task for hundreds of school systems already struggling financially. The pandemic then delivered a 1-2 punch to Pennsylvania schools already suffering from years of state underfunding. We had a drop in local revenues during the COVID-driven economic shutdown and a spike in costs to educate students and keep them safe during an unprecedented crisis. To put it simply, we were already behind pre-COVID, fell further behind during the COVID-19 pandemic, and are heading into an exacerbated crisis with the least number of resources. Our families are looking into every option for continued basic support to no avail. Decades of underfunding for special education have continually weakened the fiscal foundation of our schools. Districts are suffering from a lack of staffing, funding to provide critical resources to supply our youth with the necessary equipment and supports to access their education, and a frustrated cohort of teachers and professionals trying to support, service, and teach our youth. An investment into educational funding would also better position school districts and the state to avoid mistakes of the past, specifically cuts that were disastrous for students in schools and led to elimination of thousands of teaching and school personnel positions. We simply cannot afford to go through that again. Greater state investment can help avert another precipitous funding cliff down the road and our students from bearing the effects of that hit. It can also bring Pennsylvania a step closer to a larger and more permanent funding solution to give all students an opportunity in a post-COVID Pennsylvania. Most costs associated with special education are mandatory reoccurring costs. This means that many of the dollars coming into Pennsylvania's education system from the American Rescue Plan cannot be used to fund special education supports and services. Pennsylvania must invest in special education to address the loss of education during COVID-19 and increase its share of this funding to fulfill their obligation to special education students. This gives students with intellectual and developmental disabilities the opportunity to receive a free and appropriate education as guaranteed by federal law. Federal government relief will help school districts weather the immediate fiscal storm, yes, but it is a one-time injection of funds to deliver immediate relief of COVID-19 related costs only. Mandated costs like special education will continue to eat away at the fiscal foundation of our districts, and without additional ongoing state support, that foundation will crumble. This forces school districts to rely heavily on tax revenue from local taxpayers in an attempt to make up the difference, and poor districts the worst off. This call to action is a required and demanded necessity by us as educational advocates and leaders. Students receiving special education services, regardless of socioeconomic status, deserve a quality education that prepares them for successful transition into adulthood and the opportunity to live independent, productive lives. Opportunities we have all been given. That is why the state must increase funding for special education to schools by $200 million to keep pace with these mandated reoccurring costs and ensure that students have access to an inclusive education. This past year has taught us many lessons. If we don't act responsibly now, coming years could teach us just how bad things can become if the state doesn't take steps to fix a problem we've had all along. So again, the ARC of Lehigh and Northampton County stands with PA School Works and our local school districts in the firm request to increase an investment of at least $200 million within a $1.15 billion investment for special education. These funds should not only be used to alleviate those rising mandated costs, but provide a better and inclusive outcomes for students with disabilities and intellectual disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. So, hello and bienvenidos a Marvine. My name is Eric Fontanez. I'm the principal here at Marvine Elementary School. I want to start by thanking everyone who came out today to discuss the importance of increasing state funding in our schools. Marvine Elementary School is one of the 16 elementary schools in the Bethlehem Area School District, and we are lucky enough to be a community school. The support from our school district and the strong partnerships we have developed within the community have helped us achieve national blue ribbon status. This has not been easy for us. Many times our kids come from homes that are struggling to get by, and they need schools that are adequately funded to meet these needs. We offer a wide variety of programs such as after-school clubs, summer school, and parent engagement events. But with additional state funding, we would be able to take them to the next level. We value the importance of educating the whole child by focusing on academics, enrichment, and social skill development in every program that we offer. But it is hard to do without more funding. I am thankful for the staff here at Marvine, the partners that have helped us make so many gains, and of course, the school district that supports our ways. The reality is, due to COVID-19, we need to increase face time with our students, advance technology, and create smaller class sizes now more than ever. Once again, I want to thank you for being at Marvine today and showing your support for the students of today and our future for tomorrow. Thank you.
So I just want to thank everybody. We have an all-star crew here. We have dedicated parents and school officials who are doing everything they can to ensure that kids get the quality education that they need and deserve. I think our message to people here today is now we need our state lawmakers to step up and do the same thing. There is nothing inevitable about the funding system in Pennsylvania that leaves so many students behind. This funding system is a direct result of priorities and choices that state lawmakers make choices over the next few weeks when they negotiate the budget, choices that will prioritize adequate funding for our public schools students this year so that they can go back to school in the fall and they can have the resources that they're going to need to catch up after this extraordinarily difficult year. So we are open for questions and answers now. If anybody has questions that you'd like to ask, we have a whole slate of experts who are happy to answer them.
I know that there's been several discussions about charter school reform. How much would that impact and help to solve some of these issues? It seems like one of the big headaches that you're dealing with is funding the charter schools. We're constantly hearing that is one of the fees that is growing and not keeping up with the school funding.
Right, so who would like to field what would the charter school reform mean for your school districts? You probably have, we have.
Charter school reform.
Do you want to come to the microphone probably? Thank you.
For Allentown School District, charter school reform, even if they put back the reimbursement of the 1/3 or whatever the percentage was, that would take care of our deficit, our budget deficit every year. Our expenditures for charter schools, right out of the gate, first thing is this year, coming year will be $66 million. So that's $66 million that will leave Allentown and never touch a child or a staff person who walks into our buildings.
If I could just add to that. One of the known issues with charter funding is that charter schools get overpaid for their special education students. There was a task force at the state level a number of years ago that concluded that, bipartisan, and it was never fixed. If they simply fixed that, and that means charters got paid for the actual cost to educate their special education students, it would save Bethlehem $6 million a year. Right now, the budget gap we're trying to close for next year's budget is $7 million, just to give you context. So $6 million a year just to not overpay charter schools anymore. So it's a great question, has a real impact.
Anybody else want to come up? Yep.
Just one other quick point to make about the connection between the underfunding that we were talking about in charter schools is about, it's a little bit different given COVID-19 and the expansion of cyber charters, so this is now affecting way more districts than in the past, but if you go back to right before the global pandemic struck, about 75% of all charter costs were being paid by those districts that were also underfunded by the state. So in many ways that underfunding was sort of a double whammy for those districts. So charter reform would make a huge difference overall and would be specifically targeted to districts that are also buried under the weight of being underfunded too.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well thank you for coming out, and if anybody's watching, call your state lawmakers and ask them to support $1.15 billion in new funding for